We're going to start off yes, there was a notification, not notification on the screen, but we're going to start off with faculty lightning talk. So this is the way to get to know new faculty who are in the School of Information, and we've invited folks from within the last year and a half to 2 years who are newish and didn't get a chance to do this at the last MISC a couple of years ago. We've invited a larger group of faculty to present. So we'll have some at this session today, and then we'll also have another lightning talk session at the beginning of the winter semester. But up first, we have Justine, who is going to share more about her research. So come on up, Justine. Not at all. It's hard to get them. Okay, so this is the microphone. You can either place this or put it in the pocket. Yeah, it's a little awkward.
Okay.
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
And then you can either put through here or put through here.
Cool. So if I click through the next slide, that should be my slide. Okay, cool. Hi, I'm Justine. I started this job 2 weeks ago, and I develop methods to analyze conversations, and I do that by way of natural language processing and computational social science. So let me tell you what that means. But I'd like to start with the central idea underlying my work, which is that people do things with the conversations that they have with each other. So in your own life, you might have some conversations for explicitly instrumental reasons, like asking for a favor or completing a project. You might also have conversations with someone else just to interact. And interaction is a undertaking and a task in its own right. But in my work, I've often found myself dealing with settings where people have conversations as part of their jobs. Ta-da. So let me give you 2 examples of that for my own work. So during my PhD, this is very finicky. During my PhD, I worked with a service called Crisis Text Line. And so the premise of the service is that if you're in mental health crisis, you text this number, they connect you to a counselor, and over the course of a text message conversation, the counselor tries to move you to a firmer mental state. And so you can think of the counselor as having this very consequential and also very challenging conversational job. In a different vein, during my postdoc, I've been looking at a more administrative setting, I guess, which is traffic stops. So you can think of traffic stops as these weird conversations that police officers have when they pull over drivers. And so during these interactions, like their job ostensibly is to tell the driver what they did wrong and perhaps allocate a sanction. So they might, give you a ticket for distracted driving. Now, you might imagine a lot of other settings in this vein. You might think of very good reasons why these 2 settings are very different. But the through line that I want to point out as somebody who focuses on the interaction is that in both of these settings, people via these interactions are helping or hurting someone else. So people in crisis or drivers who are pulled over. And they're doing so with this mandated by this institution that they're working for. So be that Crisis Text Line or the police department and the justice system. So you might imagine some other features like that their jobs might be structured by conversational routines or scripts, but also because the people they encounter are so inherently diverse, there's also a lot of heterogeneity. So how do I look at these spaces? Well, my methodological background is in computer science. And so my way of studying this is to computationally analyze large data sets containing transcripts of these interactions. So during my PhD, I looked at a large collection of text message conversations between counselors and people in crisis. And during my postdoc and sort of now, I've been looking at transcriptions of body camera footage of police officers conducting traffic stops in Oakland, California. Now I know that many of you probably have a lot of thoughts about this research paradigm, and so do I. But I do think that one thing it enables me to do is to systematically look at what happens when this advances? It's to systematically look at what happens in the middle of a conversation as the action gets underway. Okay, so let me give you an example of that. So when you are a crisis counselor, your overall job is to help this person in crisis, but there's multiple imperatives you have to sort of fulfill along the way. So for instance, you need to address their situation empathetically and actually listen to them. You also need to help them advance to a calmer mental state where they're better equipped to cope with their situation. And so these two objectives are all well and good, but in practice, like implementing both of them becomes a bit of a balancing act. So you can imagine like, sitting around and listening empathetically to somebody and potentially stalling the conversation and having them counterproductively ruminate, or you could push them to move on at the risk of being callous and counterproductive in their own way. So we wanted to study how counselors manage this sort of interactional balancing challenge at each point in the conversation. And to do that, we developed a computational method to quantify the extent to which a counselor is aiming to advance conversation forwards or address like what happened before at each turn in the interaction. So on the basis of the words that they use at each turn, and a bit of linear algebra, we come up with this measure that quantifies how they're orienting the flow of the action. And when we apply this method, when we compute this measure across the entire data set, what we find is that counselors, at least in this setting, who tend to focus backwards, so who tend more to address somebody's problems than advancing forwards, counselors who tend to orient backwards tend to have better conversational outcomes, though both directions of action matter. And like this probably raises like some other questions you might have, like how do we even measure a conversation's outcome, or how do we know that the counselor had a say in it? Or like, is this a skill that can be trained or gained with experience? And I have papers on these two questions as well from a computational point of view as well, and looking at their nuances and their challenges and why it's interesting or hard to answer these questions. Okay, so what am I thinking about now? Well, a lot of things, but let me tell you about two of them. So one thing I really want to develop in the next few years is my grasp of how to study conversations in the context of these institutions, like this crisis counseling service and like policing. And I really think that interactions in these settings are interesting and peculiar. So for instance, like when you are a traffic cop, like pulling someone over in a traffic stop, these street level interactions you have with drivers, like sort of put into practice the abstract policies and goals of your police department. Now, in turn, the fact that you're a member of this department is sort of like a conversational affordance. It enables you to do things that would be kind of weird in ordinary conversation. So imagine going to somebody random right now and telling them they're getting a ticket for being on their phone. I'm sure a lot of you are earphones. So I think that looking at an institution by way of these constituent interactions could be a valuable lens into institutions and their problems. So right now, the focus of my research is to analyze how racial injustice is embedded in traffic stops. On this front, I do think that a lot of computational linguistic approaches I'm familiar with tend to be a little apolitical and lose a bit of like explanatory power. And so there's a lot I'd like to learn if you want to come chat with me. And the other practical thing that's on my mind is getting data. So if you have conversational data with conversations in it, and you'd like to chat with me, please reach out. I think something else I've been grappling with in this space of practical questions is I've often found myself in my work in this weird triadic relationship between me, the researcher, the people in the data having the conversations that I'm in some sense eavesdropping on, and the organizations giving me the data. And I think it's easy to find myself trying to tell the conversationalist story using the organization's voice. And if you have thoughts on how to grapple with that, I'd love to hear from you too. So in short, please have conversations with me. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, so for folks on Zoom or in the room, does anyone have any questions about this work, about future work? Yes.
So if you're looking at like racial justice in like police stuff, And you have transcripts, how are you going to like code what like the race is with like the person, or how are you going to like get that information?
So the question is about how to encode things like race with police data, with the transcript data.
Yeah, so the short answer is the race of the driver is given in the data, which I've largely inherited. But I think the technical answer is the race is whatever the officer labels when they fill out their post-stop case report. So yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so I was curious about the, so in these cases, it seems like the context, even though it's an institutional, you know, affiliate talking with someone else, that the power dynamics are very different, and also that these individuals not only have the kind of goals of the institution, but then their own set of goals,
Yeah.
Which you kind of hint at with the racial piece, right? They're racist, and that's a personal,
Right.
you know, characteristic as opposed to the institutional. So how are you thinking about outside of just the, you know, the person is the representation of the institution and all the other stuff that's like going on, class,
Yeah.
psychology of the individual.
I guess so. It seems like, so just to like disentangle your questions, like you're saying that, so first of all, like within a context, like within the context of policing, different police officers have different objectives. And then obviously like a police officer thinks of their job differently from a crisis counselor. And I think that like just to focus on like the first question, I guess that's hard. And I think one limitation of looking at the transcripts is that like we never know for sure like what the police officer's intentions are. So for instance, like the official way that you structure the stop might be, I'm pulling you over because like your taillight is out. But like, you know, like in their heads, they might be thinking I'm pulling you over because like your car somehow looks suspicious and I was looking for a reason. So I guess like how we would grapple with that. So on my end, like, I think I've tried to like tread the line of like, I'm kind of like studying like how these interactions add up to what the institution does in aggregate. And so in some sense, like the hope is that like you sort of like average out individual motivations, or you find like salient individual motivations like pointing in one direction, like police officers are racist. I think so I'm actually working with like a bunch of social psychologists. And so I think another tack is to perform psychological studies. I think that's what's interesting here is that you're going to like present subjects with data from conversations that happened in the past that they were not part of. And so I'm actually like really curious, like what you can and cannot learn from those. But yeah, so I guess like that's my answer. Like there's a hedge and then there's a future work with question marks. Yeah.
Do you think knowing that the interactions that you're having are no longer one-on-one in either of those situations, like somebody would have access to this data that analyzes what this thing will impact those interactions?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, so first of all, I don't have a good sense actually of like, if you're talking like, just to use a related context, like if you're talking to your psychiatrist, do you assume that like the conversation will be like recorded or even like analyzed post hoc, and like, how does that impact your behavior? So, I don't think I have a general answer, but I can say that in the crisis text line setting, first of all, like this obviously like really bothers some counselors and texters. Two, I think like some people do remark on the context, like, but to the extent of saying like, no, am I talking with a bot or like, you know, are you using my data? But I think for the most part, like, I don't really know how to think about like the counterfactual of like, this is a setting where like these two people are having a private conversation, but in aggregate later on, somebody is like reading these conversations versus these two people are having a private conversation once and for all. Like, I think that definitely like there's literature from everywhere saying that like, when you realize that somebody is listening to your private conversation, the nature of the conversation changes. And that says something really interesting about like the knowability of conversation dynamics. But yeah, that's something, you know, that's in like the last section of my thesis that I'd love to think more about. Okay.
Is it the will other factors? Is it that one?
No, she wants to unmute.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Shu.
Yeah. Hi, Justin. Here's the question on Zoom. So you mentioned for the counselor project, you have a follow-up work looking into whether the counselors can gain these conversational skills over time. I'm just curious to learn what you found out, and do you have any insights about how to help these counselors develop these conversational skills over time?
Okay, so sorry. Okay, that was weird. So in the follow-up work, like we didn't look at particular skills so much as their overall language use. And what we find is that as counselors gain more experience, like they take more conversations, their language use gets more diverse and divergent from each other. One way of thinking about this is when you start out, like you tend to adopt like similar language as the other counselors and as like the training manual. And as you gain experience, like you start to like find your own voice, which is like the subject of this paper. I think the other thing I found out in the course of working on this is that figuring out like what it means for like a skill to be learned takes a lot of unpacking that was outside of the scope of the work. But yeah, I do think it's an interesting question of like, one, how would you even like conceptualize of a conversational skill being learned when like your behavior in this conversation is so heavily impacted by the other person? And two, like, how would you help people learn these skills, given that a lot of them like in practice are contingent on what the other person is doing? So yeah, it's an interesting question and I don't have a complete answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out after the MISC seminar for today. And then for those on Zoom who have further questions, feel free to send Justine an email. So we have one more for today. Just want to make sure we have time. There's a class in here at 1, and so we'll have to leave around 12:45, 12:50-ish. But I wanted to invite up Savina to talk about her research.
I thought there were 5 people. Okay. Oh, okay. Well, I could have thrown some more slides in here, but I can find them. So this is the one that's working better.
To be active, and now I think that's clicker should work, but yeah, that has a little bit of a lag.
Okay, I think, okay, cool. So I can go a little bit slower then, which is great because this did not fit in 7 minutes this morning. I'm Sabina. My research is in the area of advancing public policy through machine learning. So I put some keywords up here because this is an introduction. And if you want to remember me by, oh, I have this problem, who can I collaborate with? I could collaborate along technical skills such as probabilistic models, causal inference, or reinforcement learning / recommender systems, which also really are kind of just causal inference again. Oh, stop working. Okay. And in domains, these are the 4 areas where I concentrate. So access to education, which I'll talk about today, computational sustainability, digital health, and political participation. I'm not really doing anything in digital health right now, so don't contact me if you have a digital health project you want a collaborator on. But the other areas are fair game. Like, I think it like doubled all of them, maybe. Oh, okay. So I'm going to talk today about a project that combines a little bit of policy and information tools. I picked this project because I think it's the most relevant to this audience, but I haven't really been to the seminar series, so I don't really know. But I'll talk about policy and information interventions to reduce undermatching in college applications. If you haven't seen undermatching, I'll define it now. So why do we care about students going to good colleges, good selective colleges? All colleges are good. In some ways, selective colleges have better educational outcomes. People argue with this all the time, but there is research. There's a lot of research. There's not as much research going the opposite direction. There's a lot of research that says selective colleges have better graduation rates, better school satisfaction, better career opportunities, better lifetime earnings, better job satisfaction, health insurance, and pensions. And I assume everyone here agrees with this to some extent because you all wanted to be a part of one of the most selective institutions in the world. So you must think there's something to be said about selective institutions. So a student will match in their college applications if given geographic constraints and qualifications. The student is either applying to the best schools within their budget or applying to the most affordable schools that are at least as selective as the best school they applied to. You don't have to worry so much about that second mouthful because I'm not going to talk about it today. So if a student doesn't do the first thing, we label them as academically undermatching. So they failed to apply to the best school. They underestimated their abilities and applied to schools which they are overqualified for. Financial undermatches may be simpler to understand, even though the definition's really clunky. This is just if you're overpaying for college. So you could have gotten a great scholarship at a state school, or you could have had a free ride at a selective institution and you went to a for-profit expensive school. So in my work, I found that hundreds of thousands of students are undermatching on the Common application every year by both definitions. And I designed a survey, few surveys to understand the potential of different intervention types from the policy side to the information tool side. And in these surveys, I solicited specific feedback about colleges at scale, which I think is probably the coolest thing about these surveys. So I could actually look at students' application history and figure out which colleges they probably should have applied to and ask them exactly, why didn't you apply to these colleges, and get their feedback. And to do that at scale, I used recommender systems. So why are students undermatching? We hypothesized 3 driving factors, and these come from the literature. They're not purely my hypotheses, but the first is situational constraints. So students may be physically bound by where they can go to college and by how much they can pay. So a standard application fee can range from $40 to up to, I think, $120 is the most expensive. So if you're taking the advice of a college counselor and applying to 10 schools, this can be financially burdensome for some students. Students might also face informational barriers, so they may not be fully informed about the application process. And students may not actually care about any of this. So we're sitting here in our ivory tower and saying students should go to exactly these kinds of schools. And if they don't, they're doing this bad behavior. Maybe students don't care. And they just want to go where they want to go, or where their friends are going, or to live by the beach. So we also investigated that. So we found that 90% of students indicated that they either had these physical constraints or information barriers, and 60% of students reported both. So I should clarify, this is around 2,000 students across the United States who did undermatch. So I could see in their application behavior on the Common App, which covers about 800 colleges, exactly where they applied. It doesn't cover all colleges. So if you're in California, most of the UCs are not on the Common App. I think we actually just didn't survey students in California to avoid that. Actually, no, we did. And yeah, so they were handled separately, but this is a broad national survey, and we can see up to 900, 800 colleges. So the kinds of information barriers students had were generally search barriers. And this is really exciting to me because search seems like a problem we can solve. We can solve with recommender systems we can solve with software tools that are currently deployed in students' high schools, such as Naviance and Big Futures. So we ask about which resources students used in their search, and students with information barriers were less likely than students without one to use established tools such as Naviance or Big Future. And they were also less likely to speak to a school counselor. I didn't put those slides in here, but in ongoing work, I'm writing a paper showing that Naviance is actually not very great. And especially for the most competitive students, it actually increases the causal chance of them undermatching. But still, it's some information versus no information. And another stat I could throw out that maybe you've heard before is that the average counselor caseload is something like, the recommended is 250, the actual is very close to 500. In Arizona, it's around 700 students per school counselor. But still, some students don't even, so some students say they didn't get a chance to speak to their counselor. And this is really interesting. I think you may have heard, maybe raise your hand if you've heard that when you're applying to college, you should think about reach, match, and safeties. Fairly common knowledge. So reaches are schools that you have a small chance, but non-zero, maybe like 5 to 20% chance of getting into. Matches should be pretty safe. 60-ish chance. I don't know in terms of probabilities, that's probably not the best way to represent it, but matches you should have some chance, not a high chance. Match, you should be comfortable, and safety, you should be very, very comfortable. So you want to apply to some safeties in case you don't get into matches, and you always want to apply to some reach because you never know and you might get in. So 80% of students who undermatched didn't think that reach schools were important, but it was the opposite for students who matched. So we also surveyed a similarly few thousand students who didn't match, and they said 80 of them did think that reach schools were important. So these undermatched students don't even know that they should be pushing themselves a little bit higher. So roughly 20% of undermatched respondents said that sticker price influenced where they went. So cost is another thing that we could help clarify with information tools. And only 30% of students said they used a net price calculator. I don't really blame them. They're very clunky. The nice thing about net price calculators is that there's regulation saying that every college has to have one, but they vary on the kind of information they require. And some of them even ask students what the amount left on their parents' mortgage is, which I find it hard to believe that high school students know. Okay, so now on the more specific side, so that was all kind of general results, but then for each student, we wanted to see if these things bore out on a more individual level. An individual student college pair level. So for every student, we asked up to 6 colleges if they'd had heard of these colleges or not. And this is where the recommender system comes in. So for every student, we found colleges that would have been a match for them. And then we filtered only to colleges that would not have been more expensive for them than the most expensive college they applied to. So we didn't want to be pushing them towards more expensive schools, even if they were more selective. And then if they said they had heard of them, we would ask, so why didn't you apply? Did you not apply because you thought you couldn't afford it, you didn't think you would get in, or it just wasn't the right fit? If they said it wasn't the right fit, we pushed a little bit harder and said, tell us this, would you have applied if you knew that you would get in? And so then some of them said, yeah, sure, I would have. And the right fit might have just been hiding other factors. So yeah, I said this list was selected with one of 2 systems. This was a popping out slide, but I hid it because I thought it was 7 minutes. So it's really simple to explain. This is just a popularity baseline. So it looks for all of the students in your high school. And yeah, in the state of your high school, we don't have students' home addresses. We know the zip code of their high school. So we can say, Within that state, where did other students apply? And then we rank those colleges by popularity. So it doesn't, the colleges don't have to be in your state, but they have to be popular amongst other students in your state. And then that's compared to a matrix factorization, which should look familiar to people. And we evaluated this looking at the latent factors for colleges and found really nice clusterings that made a lot of sense. And in simulation, this matrix factorization performed really well when we first found eligible schools and then ranked them by simulating undermatched students with matched students. It got an average precision of 0.88. But in practice, we actually found that students were only interested in about 50% of the colleges we asked them about, and the popularity baseline performed slightly better than the matrix factorization. And one potential reason why we think this is true is we evaluated the models using the simulation where we took matched students and made them look like undermatched students, and then tried to get the model to recommend good schools for them. But matched students and undermatched students don't really look the same, even when you try to force them to be, and it's much harder to predict the preferences of undermatched students. So the green lines are students who matched, and the blue bins are students who undermatched. And then we have the baseline over here and the model over there. So you could see both by the model and the baseline, we got higher precision on the students who matched versus the students who didn't, the students who undermatched. And I think this makes a lot of sense. If you think the matched students are really following this mold, they probably do. Not all of them, but if you take an example student from this group, they have a college counselor, they're being told you need to apply to reach match safeties, they're being told you have to apply to at least 10 schools, they're getting help on their essays. And undermatched students, as we see in the survey and through other questions I didn't show, they're relying on common knowledge. They're not looking up the prices of schools. They're applying to far fewer schools on average. So they're applying to 1 to 3 versus up to 10 to 20. And so they're harder to predict. Another hypothesis could be that they just don't even care about selectivity. So we checked this. Only 10% of students told us that they didn't care about selectivity. So that's probably not it. 90% said they do care about selectivity. But when we asked slightly differently, 30%, 35% said that they do care about selectivity, but they care about success even more. And I really like the way we asked this, called the big fish, little fish question. So we asked, would you rather be a big fish where you're at the top of your class, even if your class isn't that great? Or would you rather be a little fish, but in a really great pond? So students had to select which story made more sense to them or which they agreed with more. Alex wants to go to a college where she will likely earn the top grades, even if it isn't the best college. Jessie wants to go to the best college she can get into, even if she may not earn the top grades in her class. The genders were matched to the student's gender. And so here, now you see 35% students would rather be a big fish. So that could be some of why these students are under matching. And that, again, was different with matched students who are more likely to want to be a little fish. So to summarize, we found evidence for both constraints and information barriers. So constraints, both application fees and location were factors. Information barriers, not having access to counselors, underestimating the importance of reach schools, not looking for enough colleges, not using net price calculators, but then still being heavily influenced by cost. These were all factors. On the policy side, this resulted in many policy suggestions to Common App, and one they listened to. So they did change how they ask about application fees after this work. So they simplified the application fee question, where instead of saying which things you're eligible for, like free or reduced lunch versus all these acronyms of federal aid systems, students could just say any of these apply to me. So that was nice. And I don't know yet, that will happen this year. I don't know if it will increase students getting application fees. It's a really hard year to tell because a lot of students are not doing well financially with the pandemic. But we'll see. On the information side, there's a lot of tools that can be built. So some that we've been talking about are recommender systems built within the Common App. So while you're searching, you could get pop-ups showing you schools that would be better matches, along with material like, do you know you should be applying to some reach schools? It's okay if you don't look like the average student. Even if you look close to the average student, you might get in. Schools look at other factors besides grades and test scores. You should still apply. More information around cost, simplified cost calculators versus what students have access to now. Estimating students' finances, that's another thing we've been working on. So if we can predict what your financial situation is, why not just give you a fee waiver? I would really like to do that, and schools like University of Michigan make Common App afraid that that would never happen, but I think it could. So yeah, I think that's the last slide actually. There's a, yeah, okay, yeah, that's it.
Question. If you're looking at reasons, like explanations for what you're characterizing as bad decisions, I would really suggest looking at first generation status, because the kinds of information that people have access to in their household is really, I mean, these are really just two populations, and also the role of parents and that kind of that whole just seems to be totally absent from here. And these aren't like 17-year-olds who are just making decisions with their colleagues.
Oh yeah, no, we asked, sorry, this is a very expedited version of the survey. We definitely ask about talking to your parents, and interestingly, in terms of the model and behavior, first-gen students aren't really one of the groups that crop up as having this kind of, yeah, I don't want to say bad behavior, but as undermatching, they're not statistically significantly more likely to undermatch, but that's on the Common App. So I think that's where it gets kind of tricky. We do really want to work on that. I think we even oversampled first-gen students in the survey, but if you're on Common App, you already have a bunch of college-going capital that potentially first-gen students don't have. And so the other clue we can use is fee waiver status from historical years. That's what Common App uses as a proxy of financially needy. But I think the students who get fee waivers already have more information than an average financially needy student. So they don't look like you would expect them to look in terms of behavior, in terms of zip code. So it's actually, I think, pretty hard to find the group of students who you would expect to gain the most from these kinds of interventions. But yeah, we have first-gen status. Like, for example, this slide, or the slide looking at the different performance of the models, the model does fine equally well on first-gen versus not first-gen. So it's a component, but I don't think it's the only component. And in terms of parents, absolutely. And that's something we've talked about a lot, is like, how can we do interventions that go after the family unit? Interestingly, I talked to someone who runs My Intuition, which is a net price calculator tool, and he did interventions on Facebook aimed both at parents and students, and found that he had to stop the parent intervention. So this was an intervention to get them to use net price calculators. He had to stop it early because they were responding at such lower rates than students. So intuitively, I agree with you, but getting it done and getting it done well, and there's some evidence that maybe it can even be hard to reach parents.
The challenges facing first-gen students is happening kind of before they get.
Potentially, yeah. Yeah, I mean, we do have, I think it's like maybe 10 to 20%, like there's still hundreds of thousands of maybe 100,000 first-gen students we could look at. So they're there, and we have looked at, are they undermatching more? Are they responding differently on the survey? We have looked at all of that, but so far the more interesting group, they're not the most interesting. Well, interesting is the right, we don't see the patterns you would expect to see, I guess is the shortest answer, but we've looked for them.
Yeah, I think the financial piece also with the parents, and you focus a lot on the application fee, but I think it's more just that the cost and that kind of not understanding.
Yes, I have some slides that I took out of this, but like we explicitly show them, we explicitly ask like what they think costs of different colleges are. And yeah, they're like way off. Is that like, so students who undermatched, I don't know. Okay. Students who undermatched, like, and then even students who undermatched who are low income, I think only 20% of them said that they wouldn't pay the sticker price at Stanford. So like 80% of them thought they would pay the sticker price when they would get a free ride. So we didn't say Stanford, we said an elite institution, testing the assumption rate that it's fairly common knowledge that the most elite institutions basically give you a free ride if you're low income. Absolutely, students didn't know that. So yeah, that would be a critical piece of the tool we've been thinking about, is you have to have good affordability information right next to everything else about the college. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. This is a question on Zoom about if you've seen differences across student application experiences in different states, particularly in states with high-ranked public universities versus states without them. And so there's a little bit of context there, but questions around differences between states and policy concerns there.
Yeah, I mean, you have to kind of, whenever you're really thinking about anything you would do in the space, it has to be somewhat state specific for sure. Like the college now, like a simple way is if you're running a regression to understand what the effect of some policy would be, yeah, you better control for state and state characteristics, and even high school and high school characteristics. In this survey, I think the only way, well, state comes into this popularity baseline model and also comes into the kinds of, yeah, we ask specifically about other colleges that they might have heard of, and those are all state specific. There's a state specific process, but yeah, for sure. In terms of differences, state level, off the top of my head, I mean, you do see things in, like, we've looked a lot in Arizona because they have public universities that don't require essays. So an idea we've tried to push is, what if Arizona just automatically accepted people without asking them to do anything? Or what if we automatically applied on their behalf? And I could surely say that students' behavior in Arizona is nothing like in California, and that's obviously influenced by the market there.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you so much to Davina and Justine. Round of applause.